Thank you very much, Roger. As you can all see, you've overdressed. I should just say that I usually teach statistics at the University of Aarhus. I mean, Roger actually told a lot of the story about what happened to why I ended up writing this book. But one of the main points is I try to teach my students statistics and make them think. Now, I have 250 freshman students, so I have to tell each year, statistics is really not all that boring. And I really only have one teacher's trick, and that's working forth and back, because it makes it a little harder to fall asleep. And so I'm also going to do that today. But mainly what I'd like to talk about is really what is it we think about the environment and how do we actually approach this? Because it's a really important discussion, but we very often don't have the real facts. I have two basic points that I try to point out, and really I'm just going to give you the very short version of the book, right? So you actually don't have to read it. The first part is we need to remove our myths. To the extent that our understanding about the environment, our understanding of how the world works is governed by myths, and I'm going to show you quite a few of those, we're unlikely to make wise judgments, right? Basically, if we really think the world is coming apart, if we think we've painted ourselves into a corner, we're likely to make bad judgments. We're likely to act in panic and not prioritize. And that is the second point I'll get back to at the end. Basically, there's only one pot of money, right? So we've really got to make sure that we spend it right. And if we end up over-worrying about some fairly small problems, we'll end up under-worrying about the big ones. And so what we really need to do is to get the discussion in the environmental area back to saying, what are the facts and what is it that we really should worry about? The problem very often is that we don't. And the myth up here, the myth that doomsday is near, that we're somehow headed in the wrong direction, which was certainly what I believed. That was also why I thought Julian Simon was just some right-wing American guy. Well, yeah, he was. But he was also wrong. Right? And the main point here is, of course, to say, if we actually think we have a gun to our heads, we're unlikely to make good decisions. Right? I mean, we're unlikely to make prioritization. If somebody comes up to you with a gun to your head and say, give me your wallet, you're not standing around and say, gee, would I rather buy a toaster or something? You hand over the money. Right? And that's the point. And I think really also, if we're going to have this discussion, we really need to do both. Very many people that I meet have their particular myth in their particular area, and they go out and tell people, but listen, this is not true, it's actually the other way or something. But it doesn't work, because most people have this background feeling of everything is coming apart. So maybe you come and say, well, we don't actually have a gun to our head right here. But people say, well, we have everywhere else. And so they're unlikely to come down to the idea of prioritization. So I think at the very end, we're going to talk about prioritization, but we really need to get people to think about what are the statistics, what is the background, what is actually happening. And that's what I'd like to take you through tonight and give you a sense of and an overview of this whole thing. Of course, at the very end, I can only say, there's lots more in the book. Cambridge University Press has said I have to hold it up every time I'm out, so I've done that now. But basically, the idea, of course, is to say, how have things been going for humans, and try to look into the future. What are we going to do about our future in terms of well-being, what's happening with the environment, and how should we think about some of the big issues like global warming? Of course, saying all this in 40 minutes is virtually impossible, so at least I'm going to speak really fast. The first thing, are things actually getting better? Yes, in many, many different areas. On pretty much all accounts of human welfare, we've gotten better. We have more leisure time, greater security, fewer accidents, more education, more amenities, higher incomes, fewer starving, more food, and a healthier and longer life. And now, you might understand that this would be true for the industrialized world, but it's also true for the developing world. And that's perhaps the most important point to say. We have, in general, been moving dramatically forward. Things have been going a lot better in pretty much all accounts that we can look at in the past. Let me just show you one graph. I mean, I should probably tell you that we have a situation. I'm a statistician. I'm going to show you a lot of these. I think these are sexy, right? It's not the same thing, say, that everyone else does, but it gives us an understanding of what's actually happening. I should also just tell you, I mean, I'm not making up these numbers. I'm typically using the best empirical stuff we have from the UN organizations and from other organizations. This is from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. Basically, this shows you how many calories per person per day we've had over the last 40 years and what's likely to happen into the next 30 years. years. And of course, if you look up here, the developed world, I mean, we have more than 3,000 calories per person per day. If we have any problem, it's probably being too fat. So it's not really the issue here, right? But really, what is interesting is looking at the developing world. Notice how the average person in the developing world in 1961 had about 1,932 calories per person per day. That's an average, just a little more than what it takes to sustain life. Today, that number is up about 2,650 calories per person per day. My point is, and I'm going to state this very clearly because this is one of the hardest issues to get through in the environmental discussion. My point is to say things are getting better. It doesn't mean that things are fine. I'm making the scientific statement that things are improving, but I'm not making the political statement which would be say, oh, that's fine, they don't need more than 2,650 calories per person per day. But the idea is to say, this graph actually goes up. And that's an important issue to say, that things can both be improving, and yet we can say we want them to be even better. We can say both things. But it's important to point out that they're going better because that means we don't have the gun to our heads, but we can start thinking sensibly about, so, what of all these different things would we like to deal with? And of course, it's also important to say, well, actually out into the future, they're still going to be ever better fed. We're actually likely to see a population in the developing world in 2030 that on average will have about 3,000 calories per person per day. Notice that's incredibly much better, but it still means that in 2030, they will only be as well off as we were in 1961. So we can both say there are still problems, there are still things to be done, but things are moving in the right direction. Of course, one of the things I often hear, you know, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And of course, you can cheat in the sense of using, for instance, averages. I mean, sure, you can cheat with statistics, but it's also the only way that we can really understand the world. And yes, this is an average. You know, it's probably unlikely. It's just one person eating up all this stuff. But you know, it could be the middle class from the developing world, and that'd be a reasonable question, but actually not so. The UN has also made estimates of how many people who were starving since 1970. In 1970, about 35% of all people in the developing world were starving. 35%, that's more than 1 in 3. Today, that number is down to 17%. In 2030, we estimate that there'll be about 6% of all people starving. And it's incredibly important to point out, it's a much better world where there's only 6% of people starving than one where 35% of all people starving. But it doesn't mean that there's no problem. In 2030, there'll still be 400 million people starving, unnecessarily so. It's not because we can't produce their food, it's because they don't have the money to buy it. So the idea here is again to say, we can still say things are getting better and yet say there's a big problem that we still need to address. So the idea here is to say, this is just one of the backups to say, listen, in general, things have actually improved, and we have the data to point it out. It doesn't mean that everything is fine, it doesn't mean we shouldn't worry, but it means we can start seeing the world clearly, stop having the gun to our heads, and start thinking about, so what are our real priorities? Of course, at the same time, you could also say, sure, you know, maybe things are going better in a material kind of way, but what about the environmental problems? Well, actually, and contrary to what many people think, both air and water quality are in general improving, certainly in the developing world. I'm going to show you some of that data later on. And this, of course, also means that we have to start thinking sensibly about some of the biggest problems that we're facing right now, our chemical fears, our pesticide fears, our questions about global warming, and that's what I'll also get back to. And then at the end, I'll try to talk about, so what should we do? What are the actual issues that we think about, and what are our priorities, and what is the cost of us not prioritizing correctly? But first of all, if I'm actually right, I should also just ask, how come that we all think I'm wrong? How come that we all think things are getting worse and worse? Well, actually, we have these kinds of surveys. This is from the US, but we have it pretty much any country in the world, and they show pretty much the same thing. If we go out and ask people for, what do you think about your water quality? Locally, there's about 20% of all people are worried, but globally, nationally, about 90% of all people are worried. Now, this would make sense if we'd asked a specific county in the US, right? They're saying, no, there's no problem here, but there's a problem somewhere else. But of course, it can't be true for everyone, right? It can't be true that everyone says, no, the grass is browner on the other side of the fence, right? The point, of course, is that while this is something we've experienced ourselves, this is something that's mediated. And I would actually argue